Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sam Brookhouse, and welcome to the Class Play podcast on the Sumer Sports Show. As we did last week, the Class Play is going to focus on the top quarterbacks in this year's draft. And this week, our spotlight is on the quarterback currently rated at 3 by Grinding the Mocks, Drake Maye. This podcast will again be a companion piece to our written series, Tour of the Top 4, which you can find on sumersports.com. And our article regarding Drake Maye will be coming out later this week, so make sure to keep an eye out for it. Joining me again, we have Tej Seth. Tej, tell us what's new, man.
I'm just excited to be back here with the trio again. You know, Ben coming back and joining us is like a star player coming back from injury for the playoff push.
Ben, he set you up well. How you doing, man?
I mean, I think he set me up a little too well, but no, I've just been vibing. Like I said, it's good to be back. I've just been checking out the Sumer Sports NFL Draft Guide right now. I've been watching old Jake Locker highlights, so it's been great. I would say, to be honest with you.
Speaking of the Sumer Sports Draft Guide, you can find that on sumersports.com right now. A lot of hard work went into that, especially by Tej, who we have here. Tej, tell us more about the Draft Guide.
Yeah, I mean, the draft guide was really fun to put together. I hope that everyone enjoys looking it over. Basically, what we did was we partnered with our friends at StatsBomb. They gave us some advanced statistics on 2023 for all of the top draft prospects. So we did quarterbacks, wide receivers, running backs, and tight ends. We have a bunch of, pretty good data in there from what they did their last college season. And then we also have 2024 projections. So what we think they're going to perform at from a fantasy standpoint. So, you know, if you're a dynasty manager, if you're a general fantasy football player, or even just like a fan looking to learn more about those positions in particular, like I think the draft guide will be really fun for you to look at.
Awesome. And I can say it was a big part in me preparing for this podcast, and it should be a big part for the audience to prepare for the draft. A lot of great data in there, a lot of advanced analytics, fantasy tools, just pure knowledge tools. I encourage everyone to check it out. And as always, if you're on live with us on this podcast, be sure to comment, subscribe, share, and follow along. So before we start, Ben, you're rejoining us. Last week, we went over our quarterbacks who are under the radar. Who are some of the quarterbacks that are under the radar for you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Spencer Rattler is anymore under the radar. I think he's very much gone mainstream. I know you guys had some discussion on, this topic basically last week, but to me, I don't know. It's. I think if you're looking obviously at towards the end of this draft class, like I think the one guy who, and take this with a grain of salt because I was somewhat intrigued by the Jaron Hall selection of the Minnesota Vikings last year, but I think Keaton Slovis is actually kind of at least a guy who maybe fits this idea of what we're going to discuss with Drake Maye later on. It's like an early breakout year as a freshman. Obviously, a lot of that was, the situation that he found himself with at USC. But I think even given his like really weird career arc, and he doesn't necessarily have like a ton of arm strength. I think given the right offense, the right sort of situation, he's a guy that could at least be a somewhat productive fill-in type quarterback at the NFL level. And I'm not sure what exactly teams are really gravitating towards in their selections of guys, but I think if you're looking for more of like a back end type starter, Keaton Slovis is the option. If you're looking for a guy who could turn into a legitimate franchise type quarterback, then I think the only option is really Joe Milton at this point in time. So those are probably like the two that I think probably warrant like some sort of discussion just based on what you're looking at the quarterback and who you already have in your room, I would say.
Yeah, with Slovis, it'll be interesting again to follow along, given that he's another one of these transfer quarterbacks, who have been in multiple different systems. And maybe if he finds a bit of consistency, catches on with the team as a backup or someone who can show up in camp, it'll be interesting to see how he progresses. So with our first segment, we're going to do the same rundown that we did last week and keep it the same, but this time for Drake Maye. We're going to start off with the first word. So Tej, if you could sum up what you've seen from Drake Maye in one word, what would that word be?
My word for Drake Maye is potential. I think when you look at him, 6'4", 223 pounds, both are above average, compared to all other quarterbacks that have had their height and weight marked since 2005. And that matters for quarterbacks, right? Like weight and height is something that is predictive of future NFL performance. So he checks the boxes there. he had a decent pressure to sack rate. He can scramble. And I think this is something that's being lost in the entire discussion about Drake Maye right now is he was only 21 years old last year. So when you evaluate him compared to some of the older quarterbacks in this draft, Jaden Daniels, Michael Penix, Bo Nix, like I would expect those quarterbacks to have looked better than Drake Maye did last year because they had more experience than him. So I really see that untapped potential in him where he already showed a lot of flashes in college, and then you can develop him for the next couple of years and really get him in a good spot.
Yeah, you make a great point there about him being so young and showing a lot of flashes. Ben, what was your word?
Yeah, I did really like Taja's word. I think for me, the one that kind of jumps out is I would say kind of like an explosive mentality. I would say both in the way in which he, in some ways, really high average depth of target, average depth of air yard sort of situation is not afraid to kind of make the ball, I would say throw the football deep, challenge, defensemen. And I would say in some ways, like, there are concerns with the way in which he gets through, especially his first read and those sort of progression type things. But I think both as like a runner and a passer, he has an element of explosiveness that is like few if unmatched. And I think that is kind of what makes him similar to what Taste shed with his potential, like an NFL ready prospect, and one that I think a lot of people would gravitate towards in prior seasons. He kind of fits the bill of like what a quarterback built in the lab would look like from an NFL perspective for sure.
Yeah, I have to agree with that in terms of being built in a lab and being kind of just a guy that NFL scouts would want to see, play at the next level. And kind of your archetype would be a bigger guy that has a little weight on him and can throw and run a little bit at this point. I think that's kind of the ideal. And that's why the word I went with is traditional. He's a traditional prospect. He's a guy that went to one college, sat behind an NFL quarterback his freshman year, started 2 years, was pretty productive. And he's a big guy. He's 6'4", 6'5", in the 220s, obviously a little bit more room to fill out, but he has that quarterback body. He has a big arm. He's a weapon on the ground. He can make some highlight throws. But then when you look at kind of the progressive nature of where we're going in football, you look at the advanced analytics, you look at some of the intangibles that we can now quantify a little bit better, and we're working to quantify even more. He's not as great. I mean, Tej mentioned some of the stats that he's not ideal on, and I think we'll get into that more here as we start talking pros and cons. But you just look at the guy, and he's kind of a traditional guy. I think in the 90s or early 2000s, he probably would have been a lock for the number one pick just given his size. But now that we kind of have a little bit more information, particularly due to all of our hard work at Sumer and some of the hard work that's been done in other places, there's a little bit more question on him. And I think that's pretty interesting. So as we move into kind of why those questions come about, there's no two better people to ask about like the analytical pros and cons of these players. Tej, give us the breakdown of kind of his pros and cons that you see.
Yeah, so I think, one of his main pros is the sack avoidance that we talked about earlier. 18% pressure to sack rate, which was the third best out of the top 8 quarterbacks in this class. I also think, he was someone that was really aggressive. I know that North Carolina had an interesting situation last year with their pass catching group where Tez Walker had to sit out, the beginning of the season because of the NCAA ruling. And then eventually he was able to come back, but didn't end up being as productive as they probably hoped. So, it's still encouraging to see Drake Maye have a pretty high adjusted air yards in regards to other quarterbacks in this draft class. And I think that also filters into some confidence that he has. Like he's someone who can scramble a decent amount. He has, he's someone who had a pretty high scramble rate, a pretty good EPA per rush when doing so. So like that ability to know that you can push the ball downfield, you can take off when needed, I think will help him when he gets to the next level. But there are some cons. His accuracy was something that was definitely lacking in 2023. He had only a 0.5% completion percentage over expected, which is the lowest of the 8 quarterbacks in this class. I'm also a little bit worried about elevating his surroundings. Like I think, he was someone that maybe didn't do a good job of helping his offensive line play at a level above what their talent level was. You could say the same for receivers. And, Bill Connolly had a really interesting point when he was writing an article about Drake Maye, where he pointed out that among the 126 QBR eligible quarterbacks in 2023, Drake Maye had the 10th best QBR against zone, but the 105th against man. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that progresses to the NFL. Maybe you chalk up his man performance to his receivers not being able to beat man coverage, or maybe that's something that is inherently difficult to him. So I'm curious to follow that when he plays in the NFL.
Yeah, you listed out a great list there. And obviously, I think a lot of those, we look at kind of that UNC team. Obviously, it wasn't as much of a powerhouse as some of these other. J.J. McCarthy was on, even like a extremely talented LSU team with some of the wide receivers that Jane Daniels played. Ben, obviously, you have a team that is potentially might trade up for Drake Maye. What are your kind of pros and cons looking at that?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, obviously in this discussion of like all the top 4 quarterbacks, there is this element that I think, we're still in a lot of ways investigating and trying to unpack, but it is also, pretty paramount to the overall success for how these guys develop is the situation that they find themselves in. I, being a Minnesota Vikings fan, think that in a lot of ways they probably set up as well as any other team to provide the structure and capabilities and framework for a rookie quarterback to be really successful. And I think in a lot of ways, Drake Maye could be that guy because he does have, I would say, a ceiling that is potentially unmatched within this draft class. Kind of like Tage said in a lot of ways, like he has a willingness and arm talent to throw the ball deep to make a ton of these NFL type throws. There are questions about, his ability to actually get off his first read in some of those situations. But to me, I think in spots even where he probably should have gotten off his first read quicker, or maybe didn't make the correct read getting over to, across the field. Like later on, even in some of those games, we did see him actually succeed in some of that. So I think there's like an element of growth based on his age that we are kind of tearing apart, just a couple seasons where he was, a freshman and then a true sophomore and true junior playing. And I think if we go back to just how young he actually is, like you would expect some of those, initial reads and maybe the game to at some points in some plays, maybe be playing a little bit faster than what he projected. But I think overall his ability to learn from that and kind of alleviate those situations in future plays is going to speak to him actually being a really successful NFL player. So I think that's got to be his pros, kind of like, Tage mentioned, like, can he beat zone? That's a pretty, a crucial type situation. How well is he evaluating some of the defenses in which he's facing, especially when, the defenses at the NFL level are more likely to disguise, what coverage they're playing. So if he does have some of those issues, reading defenses, especially before the snap, because it was such a, RPO type heavy offense that the North Carolina Tar Heels ran, like those are the types of questions that I think can be answered. But I think given the right structure, the right coach, the right offensive coordinator, I think he will definitely find some of that success. And I think he can find it relatively quickly and doesn't really need to, go the route of like Jordan Love and sit a year or two or anything like that. I do think he is a guy that could be very successful starting off right away and actually being, that franchise type, that guy from day one.
Yeah, I think y'all both did a fantastic job of talking about how much potential this player has and that he's young, so he may reach his potential. And I think one of those kind of growth standpoints that you can see is, his first year as a starter, he was at the bottom of, ESPN's tracking of EPA loss due to sacks. Like sacks really hurt him his first year as a starter. We go into his platform year, we go into last year, and as Tage said, he actually stacks up pretty well against some of the other quarterbacks in this draft class in terms of pressure to sack ratio. And so understanding that growth is definitely a good sign and for the future, and kind of summarizes his pros when we're looking at the ability to take that big time throw ability, package it with potentially better accuracy in the NFL as he progresses. You just look at the cons, and interestingly, it seems kind of like a flip of what J.J. McCarthy was. We talked about last week, where J.J. McCarthy, we're pretty sure about the intangibles. Obviously, some of the reads and progressions we need to see at the NFL level because Michigan obviously was running the ball a lot, a little bit more of a power offense. But, you say this guy's a winner, this guy is a leader, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We don't really necessarily know that about Drake Maye, and really what is driving his value is his, physical nature, his ability to fit in, fit in throws into tight windows and kind of the more traditional stuff rather than the intangibles and the analytics. And so I think a lot of that will come together as we kind of move forward. And obviously, we've all done the research here. Tage, what would you say the most intriguing game that Maye played is for you?
Yeah, I do think it was the game he played against Duke, pretty late in the season where you have this double overtime game and he passed 41 times in that game. He rushed another 9 times. All 50 of those plays combined added a total of 22 EPA. So like we talked about with JJ McCarthy last week, where it's like, yeah, like we shouldn't knock him for having such low usage rate, but like it does add more uncertainty into like how he's going to handle a high usage rate if he has to do that in an NFL game. Like we saw that from Drake Maye multiple times. And I think this Duke game was a good example of that, where he got the ball down 3 with 41 seconds to go, was able to lead a game tying drive, ended up winning in overtime because Duke ended up missing a 2-point conversion. So you saw a very high volume, high efficiency game from him. And I think that even though there were times in the game where his accuracy was spotty, that's more of an embodiment of, what he's like as an overall prospect. The highs were really high in that game. And I think that is something that you can carry towards you as you go into the next level.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Ben, what was an interesting game that you saw?
Yeah, definitely. I don't think this was his most intriguing game by any stretch of the imagination. And I know people are going to say I want to talk about Minnesota and either the Vikings or the Gophers at any point in time. But I do think his Gophers game week 3 this past season was really an intriguing film study, both on like what side of Drake Maye do you actually fall on. I think that franchise guy who was also from Minnesota did a great film breakdown on YouTube involving this game, kind of going through every single passing play that he had. And in a lot of ways, I think you can take plays from this game on both sides, whether you are high on him or low on him, and kind of piece things together. So I think overall, from where he was at, like this was a really intriguing game for him as a prospect. He had 2 interceptions. I think he threw for over 400 yards on like 19 completions or something. So it was a ton of like big play type plays. But even the one in which I think he had a guy like wide open and he ended up getting tackled at the 1 yard line. Like it wasn't a great throw whatsoever in a lot of ways, and the guy was just so wide open. So I think evaluating where he was at, had the 2 interceptions, kind of like I said, one was from a lack of maybe handling pressure, which do you kind of put on him? I know he was behind a pretty bad offensive line at North Carolina, but I think in some ways he needs to be aware of that. And then another interception he had was just like a really flat ball, and the defender made a really good play. But there were definitely some flashes, and I think early on, especially with what the franchise guy focused on with this game, like there were reads early on that he missed, and North Carolina kind of went back to some of those plays later on, and he actually hit probably the correct second or third read on a deep post play, which was kind of like the perfect throw. And he did have a number of other plays that I would say kind of speak to his ability to make these NFL level throws. And I think overall against what I consider a pretty good secondary from the Gophers, like they kind of ran away with this one. And although, it was only on 19 completions, it was this like big play, explosive type potential that Drake Maye kind of flashed. And I think overall that was the one that, made me a pretty big believer in what he could do. Obviously some misses, but again, I think from an age standpoint, like those things are very much correctable, and we did see him kind of handle that even throughout the course of that particular game as well.
Yeah, and I think coupling Taja's points about the usage rate and with your points, Ben, about kind of these flashes that we always see. Retired donator here commenting with us said he's good at looking good, and that kind of summarizes what I've kind of seen is like the big plays look fantastic. They look NFL ready. And that's why I picked this kind of interesting back and forth shootout Georgia Tech game where honestly they ran, the Tar Heels ran a little bit more than you'd expect in a game that's so high scoring. He only had 25 passing attempts, which obviously is a good number. But when you see a guy that's put up 40, 45 attempts before in his career, especially in a Mac Brown offense, you'd expect that in a game with 40 plus points for both teams would have more throws. But you kind of get to see all of him in a game where he's hitting throws, and all of his touchdowns were pretty fantastic, and his rushing touchdown in particular was pretty good, where he kind of scrambles the pocket, sneakily is dangerous on the run and scores a touchdown. But there's a lot of misses, man. I think he probably missed another touchdown where it looks like it goes in between the guy's hands, but he's not necessarily throwing to his number 1 or 2 receiver. You got to know that, but it's a wide open guy you have to hit, especially in a game like that where it's going back and forth. There were some underthrows, there were some open guys, some strange reads that I didn't really know against, 3-seam or checking man and not knowing it's man running. And there was just kind of, it wasn't the cleanest thing. And I think you watch the whole game and you expect to see kind of Josh Allen 2.0, especially against a Georgia Tech team that struggled from time to time this year. And he seemed like a college player. And I think that kind of fits into the greater narrative that we have about his age, where obviously he does have that ceiling, but when you're comparing him to some of the more polished guys, obviously like Penix and Nix are very polished, had been in college for a while, really had the time to develop. You see stuff like that in it, and it gets a little dicey when you're projecting out to the professional level.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very valid point about kind of like that up and down and some of the misses he had. And our friend Kevin Cole, had a very interesting thread on this topic last draft season where he pointed out that, you think about 10, 15 years ago when Tom Brady and Peyton Manning were dominating the league and everyone was chasing the next Tom Brady, Peyton Manning, right? But like you couldn't necessarily replicate their high level processing, their ability to not take sacks despite not being that mobile, like different stuff like that you weren't able to replicate. And he pointed out, like, are we kind of making the same mistake going through it again, where we're chasing these traits quarterbacks now because of the success of Mahomes and Herbert, where everyone wants, their own version of that. You see Anthony Richardson go really high despite his accuracy not being great, but his traits and his, sack avoidance being at a high level. Like, how do you kind of, and I'm not sure I necessarily agree or disagree with this take. Like, I think it's an interesting point to bring up. So Ben, like when you look at Drake Maye and you see that his accuracy is below average, but he has the high level traits, the prototypical build, like how do you kind of balance that when you're looking at him from a holistic perspective?
Yeah, I think it is a really good question. And I don't think I necessarily you don't strongly disagree with Kevin, but I think overall, traits and intangibles and those sorts of things are always going to be evaluated at the NFL level. And they always have been, right? And in some ways we maybe have slightly changed the set of measurables and things that we're looking for in a quarterback, but it does seem like from a league evolution standpoint, especially with how offenses want to attack defenses, like there are more desirable traits given the overall structure for the league and the direction in which I would say defenses have kind of gone. And to me, I think, especially, edge and outside backers and those sorts of things, like guys have continuously gotten more athletic. To me, the way in which you can kind of navigate that is having a more athletic quarterback that at least offers some sort of rushing threat along with it. And then you do introduce the RPO game. And I think overall, I think that the traits and things that we're sort of looking for have changed somewhat because offenses have switched to the point where we are seeing a ton of RPOs and those sorts of things. And the quarterbacks that are most threatening in those sorts of environments need to have some semblance of rushing production in order to kind of justify those reads. So I think overall, I think to me, it's more just like an idea that the NFL is kind of a copycat league, and whatever is kind of like the most successful is very much like what people gravitate towards and try to replicate. And I just don't know if that overarching philosophy is going to lead to success for like the teams, teams C through K or something like that, right? Like the mid-tier guys, I think you need to kind of forge your own path and try other things if you actually want to be the top dog, if you don't have a guy like Patrick Mahomes or Peyton Manning or Tom Brady, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a great approach. And what I'll add to it is that, there's kind of these quote meat market stats about, your height or weight or things like that. And obviously we've seen that kind of go away to a point in baseball where, the quote meat market stats don't necessarily make a difference. I think that in football, it's interesting because they do kind of matter to a point in that, there is an archetype that we have seen succeed at the quarterback position or the defensive end position. I think the quarterback position in particular is a little bit more difficult because no one's really been extremely adept over time at identifying what makes a quarterback tick. But I think particularly when you have guys of a certain size, defensive ends, defensive tackles, and linebackers bearing down on you, there is kind of a barrier to entry or a threshold that at the minimum you want to reach in lieu of any great advanced analytics or in lieu of some other great trait that can be identified, because it's just easier to coach,
Yeah, I think it
When you
provides
have
a higher floor than like the ceiling outcome, right? Like I think it gives your offense more production at the base level, which is
Yeah.
intriguing to coaches who want to, delay the inevitable of potentially getting fired or something else.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like, how long do you have to figure out the accuracy? When you look at two quarterbacks, or I mean, the three buckets of quarterbacks, right? Like you have your prototypical pocket passers, you have your quarterbacks who can run. Like I think about like Justin Herbert as someone who's in that bucket, and then you have your pure mobile quarterbacks, the Lamar Jacksons, as like Josh Allen's. And I think about Josh Allen in particular, where it's like, yeah, he came out, did not have great accuracy, but he was a quarterback who was very mobile in his first 2 years in the league. And that gave him just like a longer time to figure out the accuracy. Like the Bills could still have a competent offense, an offense that, ended up making the playoffs with Josh Allen before he really took the big jump, because he was just someone who could run it, gave them some an extra threat in the red zone. And then his third year, topical because Stephon Diggs got traded today, but Stephon Diggs gets traded to the Bills. And like, you really see Josh Allen take that pass game jump. So it's like, when you look at these quarterbacks who are at least somewhat mobile, if they don't have the accuracy their rookie year, or even their second year, like that just gives them a longer leash to figure that stuff out.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And I think it's interesting that you talk about those three buckets of quarterbacks, because as we move forward into kind of our player comparables for this player, I'd be interested to know about, where does he project in that next few years? Does he stick in that kind of mobile range that a Josh Allen did the first 2 years and then grow into something else? Tage, what are your thoughts and what are some of your comps?
Yeah, so comps wise, we have this on the draft guide, where basically what I did was I took all of their basic college stats. So, you think about yards per attempt, you think about rush rate, rushing touchdowns, like all that stuff. Took their combine measurables, so height, weight, if they did any of the actual events, and threw it all into a K nearest neighbors algorithm, and it determined the three closest comps to them based on this very multi-dimensional analysis that was going on. So the ones that it spit out, and like again, these aren't strong comps, like they're very low percentages, but Jake Locker 23%, Justin Fields 12%, and Joe Burrow 11%. So I'm going to let Ben talk about Jake Locker because I was too young to really know much about him, but I did think that they were pretty interesting comps for Drake Maye.
Yeah, I would say as someone who, and I should probably, turn in my evaluation card in this, but the Jake Locker year was the same year that the Vikings took Christian Ponder. And I was actually like fully on board with the Vikings taking Jake Locker. And I think in a lot of ways, like this comp for Jake Locker with Drake Maye does kind of make a lot of sense to me. I think, where he was at from a college standpoint, like he did have the big arm. He could rush the football, number 8 overall pick, basically. Like he was a guy who probably didn't land in the right situation. But I think if you have Jake Locker land in the right situation, there are simulations where he ends up being a relatively productive NFL quarterback. So I actually don't mind that comp. I did think it was also interesting, like splitting the difference between Justin Fields and Joe Burrow was like interesting to me, that it was those two guys that kind of popped up from another comp according to our, your math. But to me, when I watch Drake, it is like some semblance, and I know it's going to be a somewhat popular take, and Sam already mentioned it, but I do see some Josh Allen, maybe not quite as dynamic from a rushing standpoint, but I think with his sack avoidance and the way in which he could at least get ahead of the pass rush, I think that was kind of like where I'm really intrigued with his rushing upside. And I think that's kind of the piece that I really see with him and Josh Allen, outside of just, the arm talent and the willingness to kind of make every throw. So I think in some ways, the trajectory, obviously a little bit poorer accuracy, high ADOT, kind of like we said, average depth of target over expectation, as well as what you can find in the draft the draft guide as well. You can kind of see he ranks really highly in that. That's something that Tage put out. So I do see some Josh Allen. I think there's an upside case there, and I think the downside risk, with Josh Allen is very much a Jake Locker type. So I do think those definitely fit with where I see Drake Maye and his potential range of outcomes for sure.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Josh Allen thing, because when I came in and decided to put a closer eye on Drake Maye, I was kind of expecting, given, looking at his numbers, looking at his height and weight, kind of the narrative that he's the best physical quarterback in the draft right now. I was expecting to kind of lean more to that Josh Allen comp and say, like, his ceiling would be Josh Allen. And it was kind of tough to gauge. I didn't love it as much as I wanted to when I really started digging into the film. I think a lot of people have said that he's kind of like a smaller Herbert. I think that makes sense in terms of like the college career arc. Playing and starting and being highly rated for 2 years. And then obviously as we move towards the draft, kind of slipping, at least right now, he's slipped from, a guy who was basically locked to go 2 to now he's more likely to go 3. And there's questions about whether someone may trade up and select JJ McCarthy, and what does that do to the quarterback market. So I can understand that. I think Herbert is a little different. I think you mentioned the bucket about guys that can run. I think they both kind of fit there. When I was thinking about what he projects to in the pros, I think like a Ryan Tannehill kind of makes sense, a guy who the team probably leans a lot more on his mobility than probably makes a ton of sense, but is effective in an offense where that's run heavy and a structure that's really good. And I think that's kind of the best comp, given his height, weight, athleticism, in terms of a guy that's in the pros right now, and in terms of what, on the average sense, we may be able to see from Maye going forward.
I actually really like the Carson Wentz, Ryan Tannehill comps, because again, like the buckets that I just talked about a couple minutes ago, it's like, yeah, you have your quarterbacks who will pass most of the time, but they can scramble when needed, and they can be pretty effective at it. Like, they're not just complete statues back there. And I think like he fits that type of quarterback where, like, even you think about like Wentz, especially when he was still good. It's like, yeah, like that's someone who had the size and the weight to actually like take a hit or two and maybe break a tackle when he was scrambling. And like, I think Drake Maye could do that. I know he did that at UNC from time to time. So like maybe he can translate that over to the NFL.
Yeah. So we talk about that fit. And Ben, this is your time, man, as Vikings expert number one, the number one Vikings expert on the internet, Ben Brown. Obviously, the Vikings have those 2 picks. They're looking perhaps to trade up, may be the target. What are your thoughts on how he fits with your Vikes?
Yeah, I think first of all, Matt Collar is going to have some issues with any of those claims that you just said. He probably would have me ranked like 14th on the Vikings Twitter list or something, which might be a little bit more accurate. But no, I think and it is obviously like the Vikings for me as far as like best fit. But I think overall, from like what Kevin O'Connell can provide to him, they obviously can very much like build an offense that's going to be productive around him. Having Justin Jefferson, having TJ Hawkinson, having Jordan Addison, like they obviously went out and got Aaron Jones as well. Like, they have a legitimate offense. I think very much like it's kind of rounded into form, and he could kind of be, that one missing piece. Obviously, in some ways, he probably doesn't need to be as accurate in the Vikings context as what he would need to be in like a situation with the New England Patriots or the New York Giants. I think overall, like, this is going to be a much more robust downfield passing attack if he does end up in Minnesota. And I'm not saying like he's going to end up in like a Jameis Winston type situation, but I do think defensively, like, the Vikings have a ton of holes and a ton of issues that they need to get right. And they are going to play some explosive games. And you could kind of see, Drake Maye in a similar fashion to what we saw with Jameis Winston, in Tampa Bay with the receivers that he had, leading the league in passing yards for like a 10-7 type team. Like, I think that's kind of the direction I see in which he could be most productive for these first 2 seasons. I very much think that it has to be, from a Minnesota Vikings standpoint, they have to be very much like the ideal landing spot for him for sure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we mentioned the Vikings. I think there was an interesting thing that me and Tage were talking about earlier this week about how he technically would be the best fit for any quarterback. And there's a chance that if the Vikings do end up trading up for a quarterback or sticking and taking a quarterback a little later, he may end up being the best quarterback selection just based off of the infrastructure. So Tej, what do you think the kind of fit is there, and who else do you think he may work on?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point by you about the infrastructure, by the way. Like, you think about nature versus nurture, and if you believe in nurture when it comes to how well you can support a rookie quarterback, like I think that the Vikings are definitely one of the top teams to do that, like Ben mentioned. I think I'm going to throw out like the other obvious one here, but like the Commanders, I think would work with him, right? Like, you think about when you look at what they have already at wide receiver, between Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson, and what they can provide from like someone who wants to push the ball downfield and true like ball winners that can work in the intermediate and deep range. Like, I think that would work out really well for him. Cliff Kingsbury is someone who is more of like a wait and see offensive coordinator, just because like we don't know what he's going to look like just purely running an offense at the NFL level. We know what it looked like when he was a head coach. And, I thought that his first year or two in Arizona, like their run game with Kyler Murray was like legit. So like maybe he still has some of that designed run aspect to having a quarterback that can run in that. But I think Washington would be an interesting choice as well. Tennessee was one that crossed my mind, but I don't think that it would necessarily work out, because when you look at the Bengals last year, they had the lowest average at the target in the entire league. And, I think Drake Maye is someone that's going to want to push the ball downfield. So with Brian Callahan coming over to be the play caller, like maybe they do roll with Levis, who actually, funny enough, had the highest ADOT in the league last year. So it'll be interesting to see how those styles kind of clash, but that could be a potential option for the Titans as well, if somehow Drake Maye gets past like the third pick or something.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And you bring up the Titans. That's really the only thing I have to add to all of our Minnesota love. I think a team, should he really drop, I think a team that already has a quarterback, I think you're in a great land to show, kind of a Jordan Love. Maybe he sits for a year behind a Matthew Stafford or something like that. Like, who knows? Ben, we're getting calls for more Minnesota propaganda. Right. I'd love for you to answer this question from Sean Donahue. Would you be willing to move Jordan Addison to move in the top three? Do you think that it will take a move including something like Jordan Addison? What do you think it will take to jump up and get a Drake Maye type player?
Yeah, and I would say, yeah, even just Sean's last comment as well. I feel like I've worked the inside wire with the Vikings. We were on the Kirk Cousins to Atlanta trade early, so I've worked everything I possibly can. Here, I think, to me, and going back to, like, I do think the Vikings very much are kind of enamored with Drake Maye, and I think they do want to do what they can to move up. The question is like, what do they actually have to give up to the New England Patriots in order to have that selection if the Commanders, don't take him at number 2 overall? And to me, I would love if they would take, the 2 first this year in Jordan Addison. I don't think that would probably be and maybe it's my read on, the wide receiver market in general. I was a little bit surprised. I would say that the Bills even got, a second round pick for, Stephon Diggs today. Obviously, Jordan Addison and his rookie contract situation are different, but I think if you can give up 2 firsts and Jordan Addison, I would definitely do that. To me, I think it's going to take, the multiple firsts this year and the first next year. And I think that's going to be the sticking point to whether, Kwesi wants to do that or not, basically, to get up to number 3, or if he would need, assurances that his guy is going to be at that selection before making that type of move.
Well, I think the interesting question is, like, you talk about pairing the 2 firsts this year and Jordan Addison versus, instead of Jordan Addison, you're trading the future first next year. Like, if you're the Patriots or Cardinals, which one would you rather have? And then if you're the Vikings, which one would you rather give up?
Right. Yeah, it is a good question. I think, and like, so much of the expectation would be like where the Vikings obviously land with that future first round pick. But to me, I would still be more confident in giving up Jordan Addison just based on the way in which I would say his rookie year unfolded. I do think you have a lot more information on where he's at. And he definitely did have some flashes, but I think overall, there was situations, especially with Justin Jefferson's injury, where he probably didn't pop or do things that he would maybe have needed to do to really legitimately the answer. Like, is he going to be like a top 15 pick or something in future seasons? And to me, I think the question is still out on that. So I'd probably lean in Jordan Addison's direction from Minnesota. But I am with you. I do think in a lot of ways, both the Patriots, Commanders, and Cardinals would probably all lean in the future first direction, I would say as well. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. You're looking at 2, 3, and 4, and including the Vikings as well. The Commanders, obviously, new ownership, sharing ownership with the 76ers. The 76ers in the history, obviously now they have Daryl Morey, have been a if not perhaps one of the most across sports investors in analytics. I would expect something similar to come from the Commanders. Obviously, they may be glancing at some of the literature and saying trading back, we could get immense value. You look at pick 3, the Patriots, Kraft Analytics Group, they have holdings in analytics too. Do they think trading back may be worth it? And then obviously pick 4, we all saw the video of their general manager come out yesterday where he's working the phones, he's checking if it's an even deal. They're using points and trying to really figure out how to trade back last year. Maybe this is another situation where, a JJ McCarthy comes up before Drake May and he's on the phone with the Vikings, who are ran by an extremely analytical mind, and they're having these kind of pick value battles and trying to align the pick value to make it right. So Ben, I think that's great insight, and I think that this is definitely something that at 2, 3, 4, and whoever would be trading up would be a discussion that would be had. And so moving on to our final segment about Drake May, let's say it's 4 years from now. Drake May has played out his rookie contract. Maybe he's going to play a 5th-year option, maybe not. What do you think we are talking about at that time? Tage, would love to hear what your thoughts.
So I think he's going to be someone where people who really grind the film, or people who do a lot of film-based grades, will be higher on than his EPA, his production numbers, because I think when you look at like some of the things he did in college, from what people are saying about him as a draft prospect compared to like what his EPA per play actually was, like that told a pretty similar story. We're going to see what situation he ends up getting drafted into, right? Like obviously we talked about the Vikings. Like I don't know if this will necessarily hold true for the Vikings, but maybe some of the other teams in that top 5, top 10 range it'll take Drake May a little time to get the infrastructure around him to really to have a top 10 production, but he could still continue to put out top 10 film and be in that kind of like Trevor Lawrence, Justin Herbert area where like when you watch him, it looks good and it always doesn't show up in the stats.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Ben, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I do love that. I would say from what Tage provided with the Trevor Lawrence, Justin Herbert. To me, I think he'll probably be like a tier below that, where we are still really trying to evaluate, especially if he ends up in Minnesota, like how much of his performance is reflective of the structure and environment that he had around him, and then very much trying to decide or decipher if they should be extending him or giving him that high lucrative second contract basically. And I think that's going to be kind of where he's at after 4 years. Hopefully they've hoisted, one, if not 2 NFC North division champions, hang the banner over the Detroit Lions, and we'll see how that actually plays out. But I think overall, like, we might be having, similar conversation with Drake May as far as like, he does provide some things, especially from, an explosive play type rate, but kind of like what Tage said, like the EPA per play, how consistent he is. Is he as good as we're projecting from a sack avoidance standpoint? If he is, then I very much think he'll probably be, that could be like that fringe 10 to 11, 12 quarterback type production, I would say.
Yeah, and I agree with both of your standpoints. And Sean has an interesting point in the comments here about in 4 years, the Wilfs will have a new wing built at the practice facility for all the Lombardis. I think this represents an interesting edge case that I think out of all the players in the draft, May is probably the most likely to fit in, obviously. But it would be that he goes to the Vikings or he goes to a good team and then wins immediately, but maybe doesn't have that statistical background, maybe isn't providing a ton of value long term, and he just becomes kind of a player like Carson Wentz, where he does provide value, but he ends up getting moved off of because maybe they extended him and he's too expensive. Maybe they don't want to give him the 5th-year option, even though the wins were there and maybe he led a team to a Super Bowl or something like that. I think this is a great question for Tage to answer. On a serious note, do you think his mobility and sack avoidance are being under-discussed?
Yeah, I mean, I do think so. I think that, you guys did a great job of talking about that throughout this episode. But like, again, going back to our draft guide, out of the top 8 quarterbacks in this class, 3rd best pressure to sack rate, 10% scramble rate, which was the 4th highest. And then he had a 0.64 EPA per rush. So, he's someone who could be used on design rushes as well. So like, I think because of, probably his build or, the stuff when you look at him, like you don't think about him as like someone who's going to be really good at avoiding sacks, scrambling, being used on design rushes. But like he's probably being underrated in that regard, like Sean mentioned in the chat.
Yeah, I think that's a good view. So that'll conclude our kind of breakdown of Drake Maye. But before we go, we've been building the team. We have a lot of players on our team now. Ben is a little empty-handed. He has a couple. He has a couple that he's missed. But we'll start off with safeties this week. Obviously, on my team, I have Reggie Bush, Al Woods, Barkevius Mingo, Dez Bryant, Michael Crabtree, Malcolm Jenkins, who is kind of a cheat pick for a cornerback because he came in as a cornerback. I'm actually going to do the same thing with safety, where I'm picking Tyrann Mathieu. This is a guy who, we talked a lot about last year about how things have kind of changed, just more in society, and how football can be kind of a harbinger of that. Tyrann Mathieu wins the Heisman, a fiery player, an undersized player, almost wins the Heisman, a Heisman finalist with a great year. Then the next year is expected to be a Heisman finalist again at kind of a nickel safety, which at the time wasn't extremely used across college, and then obviously gets arrested for I think it was marijuana charges, ends up getting suspended for a whole year according to NCAA rules, drops extremely to I think the 3rd or 4th round, and then obviously comes in, has had a really long and really successful career across the Cardinals, the Texans, Chiefs, and the Saints, where he is now. And he's been really successful. I think he's just a good guy, kind of another guy who was drafted as kind of a tweener corner. People didn't know where he fit. And then as the league has evolved, it doesn't really matter where he fits. Obviously, he can blitz, he can play safety, he can play a little nickelback to play in the box against the run. And that's why I think he's an interesting prospect to look back on now in 2024. Tage, what are your thoughts?
That's a fantastic one. I mean, watching Tyrann Mathieu highlights at, when he was at LSU, just such a cool nickname too. On top of that, like that was definitely, someone who had a lot of aura early on here. But for me, I'll go with Kyle Hamilton. So, I think about like when I realized like, wow, this Kyle Hamilton's special. I remember, when you're a draft degen, like I think we all are, you look at big boards of the next year's draft, like, even before, sometimes the previous year's draft had been completed. And like, I remember he was someone that was talked about. I was like, all right, like he's going to be one of the best safety prospects of recent NFL history or NFL draft history. So I'm like, okay, this is pretty cool. Like I'll check him out. Notre Dame played a Monday night game against Florida State week 1 of that season. And, that game is remembered because of a Brian Kelly quote after the game. But what I really remembered from that game was his 2 interceptions. He had one where he crossed the entire field to get the interception. Like, you notice his speed, his ball recognition, like everything that he's shown as possibly like one of the best safeties in the NFL right now, he showed in that game. And I just really thought that he was going to be something special at the next level. And I'm, unlike some of the other people on my team, like Tavon Austin and Justin Blackman and DeAnthony Thomas, like Kyle Hamilton actually did it at the next level, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I was lucky enough. I was at Notre Dame working, getting my master's that year, and he was an interesting prospect because of his size. And but I guess despite his size per se, he could really play every 2nd or 3rd level defensive position, and that has obviously translated really well to that dangerous Ravens defense. Ben, on shorthand, you're going with an absolute ringer here. Who are you picking?
Yeah, I'm going with the OG. Has to be the best safety of all time. I would say Ed Reed, basically. I got to bring him in to solidify the back end of my defense like no one else ever could. I would say if you need any more Ed Reed propaganda, I'm sure you guys have probably seen it, but like when the discussion with Bill Belichick and Peyton Manning when he like baits Peyton Manning into an interception basically is like the greatest defensive football play ever. Like nobody has come along like Ed Reed, and I don't know if anybody ever will again. He was just simply, I would say, like probably the best at his position and really didn't do it from like a physical standpoint. It was like so much mental. And I think like evaluating him and how productive he was would just be like such an analytical challenge because he's very much like, kind of chasing magic in a bottle. Kind of our discussion earlier on, like you're just not going to find a production trying to pinpoint or find another Ed Reed like you could. So to me, he's the standard bearer and simply the best, basically, for sure.
Yeah, we like Sean tuning in here with his class play pick. Bob Sanders, another legend. I think I'd have to pick Ed Reed over Bob Sanders. Ben, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so. I think so too. I don't know. I'm partial to Ed Reed. I might be showing up next week with an Ed Reed jersey, so we'll see what happens.
Great. Well, thanks, guys, and thanks everyone for tagging in. Before we leave, I know we're all kind of working on some other things. Tage, what are you working on? What should people keep an eye out for?
I mean, after the draft guide, I don't even know if I have anything left to do. I think that took up so much energy from me. But no, I'm actually going to be working on some graphics for the draft show that we're going to do. So all of us, I think, will be on it. We'll be broadcasting live on April 25th. So time to really start preparing for that.
Awesome. And I know me and Ben have been working on this Drake Maye piece. Ben, any final words on Drake Maye?
No, man, I would say check out the Sumer Sports NFL draft guide. It's second to none in our industry, just like Ed Reed, I would say. So get on it.
Great. So Ben, Tage, want to thank you for joining me. Everyone in the crowd, the audience on Twitter, YouTube. Again, make sure to follow us and subscribe. Go check out our draft guide. All you need is an email for something that I would pay years ago and even still today. I would pay hundreds and thousands of dollars for great information like that. It didn't even exist 10 years ago, and now it's brought to you only for the price of an email. So make sure to check that out. And from Ben, Tage, and Sam, and Sumer Sports as a whole, thank you very much.